A lot of really amazing people here. I know a few of the folks who are here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Zolli, and I am the last presenter of the day. So I first want to honor your incredible bladder fortitude to have come to this moment. I'd like to welcome you to, what time is it exactly? What is it, 4:30, thereabouts? The peak learning hour of the day. The asymptotic minima between the time you last ate and when you will next drink. And what they have told me is that they have put snipers up in various rafters, so if I go substantially over, you may just see things like this, at some point, and I may be taken out. So first of all, it's great to be here with you. I really want to thank, it's an amazing company to be in, and you've had more evidence of that than even I have today, as I was only able to be here for part of this really amazing gathering. But it's been incredible to see the energy and some of the extraordinary ideas, and I know some of the folks who've you've been honored to listen to today, and really, it's a really great group, and I want to congratulate Heather and everybody here for putting on a great gathering. So right on. Thank you. Now, I just want to say a couple quick things about myself, since most of you may not know anything about me. Really quickly, can you guys pull my slides up? Actually, yeah, okay. I think those are the PDF slides and not the PowerPoint slides. But can you put the PowerPoint slides up? No? Otherwise, I'm going to do my talk as interpretive dance. And let me tell you, you will pay to make me stop. It will be painful, and we will earn back all of the resources. So I'm going to keep going along with these, and we'll just sort of see how it goes one step at a time. Now, because most of you don't know very much about me, I thought I'd tell you just a couple of quick things about myself. I am the curator and executive director of a global innovation network called PopTech. We bring together scientists and technologists and engineers and designers, corporate and social sector leaders, to collaborate on new approaches to some of the world's toughest challenges. These are really significant global areas. We believe that the world is organized into silos of excellence, and the of excellence part matters a lot. When you're trying to tackle a complex problem like vaccine innovation or delivery or major issues in public health, it's important to get the experts working together at the edge. But cutting across those silos of excellence are amazing innovation opportunities when you can get people to work together in unconventional ways. In addition to that work at PopTech, I am also one of the explorers at the National Geographic Society. I'm part of their Big and Tall program, where they fed fat men into submarines and send them to the bottom of the ocean. That whole thing where you saw, the famous film producer recently, Mr. Titanic, James Cameron, go to the bottom of the ocean. That was right after me, But I float. And I just finished working on a book on resilience, which is going to be the main subject of my remarks today, which will be out in July all over the place. So I want to talk to you about a project that I've been involved with for the last now 3.5 years. Traveling from the coral reefs of Palau, the back streets of Palestine, to the back corners of Bangladesh and Indonesia, and neuroscience research university institutes around the world, looking at the emerging heuristics of resilient systems. So why is this important? Well, I want to tell you, and there's a little bit, go to PopTech, lots of free, amazing content, much like the extraordinary things you've seen here today. I want to start this story by this whole conversation with you this afternoon by telling you a story. This is a story that happened in Mexico City in 2008, when on a very typical day in Mexico City, as people were gathering in their homes and getting ready for the workday, and people beginning to make their breakfast, a really extraordinary gathering started to take place in the town square, one of the major squares in Mexico City. As ordinary citizens and activists and farmers, campesinos, started to gather, and they started to protest, and the protests grew, first by hundreds and then by thousands. And these protesters did not hold a gun over their head. They did not hold signs. They simply held up what you see here, ears of corn. Because these were what came to be known as the tortilla riots, food riots in Mexico City that threatened to destabilize the fragile new democracy of the new administration, democratic administration of Calderón. So why did this happen? Well, the protesters railed against big business. They railed against big farmers, big ranching operations. They railed against the government. But actually, the issue was not, for the first time, really those organizations, those individuals' faults. Rather, the fault lay a few years prior to that with this event, Katrina. Because when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast of the US, and all of us were paying attention to what was happening on the Gulf Coast, something really surprising and important was happening that we couldn't see. And that is that when America shut down the 2,900 oil refineries that dot the coast, the price of gasoline, refined gasoline, jumped really dramatically all over the country. And it made the price of corn, which is used in ethanol, look relatively cheap by comparison. And so this, in turn, caused a jump in ethanol production in the US. And not long thereafter, our own Congress got involved, mandating a five-fold increase in ethanol production, a five-fold increase in ethanol production, and 40% of it to come from corn. And what this did was cause American farmers, who were among the most subsidized and most efficient in the world, to divert more and more of their crop to non-human edible varieties. And as they did that, because corn is a very oil-intensive crop, it takes a lot of oil-based fertilizers to grow corn, not to mention the fact that you're going to use the end result, the fruit, if you will, to make gasoline itself. All of a sudden, the price of corn and the price of oil started to move in lockstep. And I'm sorry I can't show you the chart because these are kind of wonky slides. But what we started to see was that as the price of corn started to move, for the first time, the price of oil moved in lockstep and vice versa. So then there was a speculative bubble in the oil markets. And in an era of NAFTA, more and more farmers in Mexico had switched their crops or gotten out of the corn markets altogether. And there was a huge price escalation, a 400% increase in the price of the most basic food staple in the country that had first domesticated corn, and you got this. Now, what I want to call your attention to about this story is the following. It ties together ecosystem change, climate change, the energy system, the global economic system, the food system, the public health system, poverty alleviation, all indicted by a single set of facts, and nobody, and I mean nobody, saw it coming. Because we live now in an era of intrinsic volatility, weirdness, systems connected to each other in ways that we can scarcely comprehend, leading to outcomes when there are disturbances in one part of the giant hairball that are virtually impossible to predict. You know that giant hairball? That's what we all work on. Right? We all work on the giant hairball, that massively interconnected set of forces that give rise to the most intractable challenges that humanity faces. That's what we're up against. And that hairball has gotten more tightly connected because globalization, for all of its benefits, has tied together systems at radically different time signatures in different parts of the planetary system and different parts of human civilization in ways that we could not possibly understand. And if we understand them, it's usually only in retrospect. It's only teasing apart what happened, not what will happen. It makes forecasting really, really hard. And we bring to the entire exercise of thinking about the future a really crappy piece of equipment, namely the one between our ears. And I can best explain that to you by showing you these two fabulous pictures from the beginning of the 20th century. This is what people 100 years ago thought life was going to look like at the beginning of the 21st century. I'm sure you recognize it from your own home, right? People thought we were going to be living in giant electrical transformers and that we were going to be rolling our whole town over to grandma's house in one of the most schizophrenic relationships with the natural world that you can possibly imagine. But they did get the tagline right. I don't know if you can see that on the upper right, trade your trouble for a bubble. We did that, but pretty much everything else. Now, these images, the reason we laugh is because we get it wrong. And were these people stupid? No, they weren't stupid. But they were evidencing a bias that I have and you have and everybody you know has. It's a cognitive bias called the novelty bias. When human beings draw forecasts and make pictures of the future, they often take the thing that is the newest and they make it the dominant thing. So if today is about a recession, tomorrow is about a depression. If today is about green technologies, tomorrow is a green utopia. If today is about a public health pandemic or the threat of a pandemic, tomorrow it's civilizational collapse and onwards and onwards. And I can give you a perfect example of this, and I hope these slides work out. I'm not sure how they went. So in 1977, there were exactly 4 members, well, 3 in this picture, but there are actually 4 up there, 4 members of the International Brotherhood of Professional Elvis Impersonators. Now, it takes a certain gonadal circumference to call yourself the international anything when you have 4 members of one organization and they all live on the same block in Las Vegas. But with a lot of effort, chaptering efforts, they outreach. Today, there are more than 35,000 male and female. Give it up for the sisters. Male and female members, you know who you are, of the International Union of Professional Elvis Impersonators. And at this rate, by 2050, 1 in 3 people on Earth is going to be an Elvis impersonator. So pretty much everything you've heard, all this global challenge stuff these guys were talking about, it's all got to change, man. We've got to get it into sidebar, handlebar mustaches and peanut butter and banana sandwiches and fat suits with sparklers on them, the whole thing. Now, unfortunately, I won't be able to show you this image, so I'm going to skip ahead but I do want to show you this. There's another bias that we bring, and that is the myth of our own rationality. We think, when we think about the future, that we think about all risks the same way. And over here, I'd like to compare 2 risks for your benefit. Over here on the left-hand side, we have what's called the bad dude risk, the risk of terrorism. Everybody in this room knows about this risk. There isn't a single person here. We hear about these 2 risks in the media roughly at the same frequency. Over here, you have the disappearance of the largest glacier inside of Patagonia inside of a single lifetime. Now, the folks at the RAND Corporation did a head-to-head comparison of your personal health risk associated with these 2 trends, and here's what they discovered. Your chance of being affected by the threat that's on the left, the threat of terrorism, about 1 in 28 million. Also, roughly about your odds of winning Powerball lotteries. So if you get affected by terrorism, please buy a lottery ticket. It'll even out. We spend trillions of dollars to go after this threat. This is an important thing. We galvanize civilizations to deal with the existential threat of terrorism. However, your chance of being affected by climate change, about 1 in 6, and that means 1/6 of the people in this room going to live a shorter life because of it. In this room. Not in faraway places. Today, right now, here. 1/6 of us. Who wants to play that lottery? And yet we can't even get the people who make decisions for our societies to agree to have other meetings about it when we get them all together in the same room. And the reason for that is because our brains are exquisitely attenuated to deal with the risks that are embodied in other people. Because our ancestors primarily had to deal with the threats not from lions and tigers and bears, but from other humans. So we're very, very good at finding out what that guy who might hurt me thinks. We're really, really good at threats with a face, threats that break a moral taboo. Right? Threats that are fast-moving, but threats that are slow-moving, more abstract. For instance, what's the #1 killer of Americans today? Does anyone know? Heart disease, exactly. Kills millions of Americans, but we do not have an international war on cheeseburgers. Thank God, because I would need to become Canadian, and I would change the entire psychosocial order with this kind of personality up there. So we understand risk But unpersonified risk, it's very, very hard for us to contend with. So in this environment in which we have linked together systems that are intrinsically complicated to create outcomes that are impossible to predict with a faulty piece of equipment, what is the agenda? Well, increasingly, the agenda is going to be about creating resilience. And this is a meta-level shift. This is a shift, the scale of which there may only be a couple of these kinds of shifts in your lifetime. This is a big one. The big one, I'm not just advocating it. We've been out reporting about it and looking at it and thinking about it, and it's clear there's a massive new convergence around this. Why? Because we are moving out of an age that is defined primarily by risk mitigation and into an age defined by risk adaptation, as we inherit the impacts of all of this consequentially connected global system. And you can see that actually in the shift from sustainability to resilience, right? Imagine for a moment that we take a big global threat, let's take climate change, we put all the people who care about that threat in a car, and we send that car careening toward a cliff of irrevocable change right about here. Now when the car is taking off, let's put in that car, by the way, all the people who care about climate change want to make a difference about it. It's a big, complex problem, much like the public health issues that we think about here are big problems. We put in this car all the people that care about it, and as we send the car toward the cliff, at the beginning, the people who have the moral authority say things like, stop, turn around. Do you know where you're going? You're about to go over a cliff. And they're right. That is the moral and appropriate thing to say as you are getting going. But later, as history and civilization says, no, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep building coal-fired power plants. We're going to keep doing all the other things we do. As the car gets closer to the cliff, another group of people come to moral authority, and they say things like, we'd better put an airbag and some parachutes on this thing because we're going over the cliff, and there are vulnerable people in the car who could get hurt by the disruption. And they're right. And somewhere in between, there is a shift from thinking about coming into equilibrium with the cliff and surviving going over. And that's exactly the point where we are right now. I can tell you, I just came from a huge global gathering that the Rockefeller Foundation has put together. They've made resilience one of the two principal areas in which they're going to invest for the next century. Right? We see it with big foundations and big corporations and governments and institutions all beginning to think about resilience in a deeper way. So, a few things that are important to say about resilience. First of all, the ability to maintain core purpose with integrity is not the same thing as robustness. We can harden systems, right? Think about the pyramids. If you knock them over, right, they've lasted for thousands of years, but if you knock them over, they're not going to put themselves back together again, right? Nor is resilience really about redundancy. It's not about having an extra system. And the reason for that is that that extra system actually imposes a carrying cost on that system. That having that extra capacity is expensive. It's great to have an extra tire when you are alone in a car late at night on a deserted road and you get a flat. But it can be incredibly expensive to carry an entirely extra set of cars with you, or an extra set of tires with you all the time. Think about what it does to your mileage. So there's always an effort. Redundancy helps, and robustness helps, hardening system helps, having extra reserves helps. But over the long course, we are under enormous pressure to invest what little reserves we have into other areas to spread that around. So instead, what we see is a new set of design principles emerging. Over here on this would be my right and your left, we have a set of design principles that are primarily about systems. How do we design resilient systems? And I'm sorry it's a little hard to see, but designing resilient systems is found in things like building systems that have much better feedback systems and can decouple themselves from bottlenecks and can change their metabolism in real time to deal with emerging and changing circumstances, that have a kind of internal modularity and self-reorganization, that are strongly local and use the power of networks. These are design principles for all kinds of systems, including public health systems. And on the other side of the equation, you have people who are thinking primarily about building the resilience of people, social systems, starting with individuals and building up through families and communities and organizations and groups. And there we see a focus on things like normative changes and belief systems and mental habits and practices and the health of communities and ways of fostering greater cooperation, diversity, and some principles reappear on both sides, including especially diversity. The biodiversity of the reef and the social diversity and cognitive diversity of the clan matter enormously to the resilience of both. Today, these two systems have been largely separated from each other. These two pattern languages of resilience have been separated. We are going to see in the years to come new places that bring them together, and one of the places that we are going to bring them together in the most powerful way is in the area of public health, where you've been doing some of this already. You are, in fact, in many ways, those of you who are involved in thinking about and working actively in public health today, you're working at the intersection of these kinds of design principles. And they belong now not just to you, but importantly, they will have to belong to the world. So I'm going to talk in the next, first of all, how you doing? You doing okay? Okay. Because I've been going a little bit slower. This is the second of 15 sections. No, I'm just kidding. But I do have a little bit to tell you, so I want to just talk with you a little bit about a couple of ideas. I'm going to go along, and then we can just have a little quick check-in and find out if you guys want to go a little bit further, and we'll just go until you basically collapse or your bladders explode. So, okay? Good? Okay. So now I want to talk to you about norms. And in order to do that, I want to tell you a story from the beginning of the 20th century, again, another story from 100 years ago. When the car first came to Britain, there were no rules of the road. Nobody knew on what side of the road to drive, so they picked the wrong one and drove on it for the rest of their lives, right? And the reason that there were no rules for the road was made worse by the fact that according to the 19th century and early 20th century standards of decorum and privacy, proper English gentlemen would put up these massive 30-foot tall hedges around their property so you wouldn't have the burden of having to look at their opulence, right? They were doing you a favor by protecting you from the very fact that they were living a much nicer life than you were. And so privacy hedges dominated in the English countryside. And there was a movement, because automobiles were now barreling down the roads like Luke Skywalker during the Death Star and getting killed and bumping into people at perpendicular angles, to chop down the hedges. And so there was a movement by the British Motorist Association to do this. And right about this time, there was a letter that appeared in the Times, the Times of London. And it said, you have to imagine this in a Lord Crustybottom III kind of voice. Before any of your readers can be induced to cut down their hedges, they may like to know what happened to me. I cut down my hedges for about 30 yards back to a height of 4 feet. What happened as a result of improving the safety of the roads? This is what happened. First of all, everything was covered in dust and the accident rate went up. Why? Because people used the improved safety conditions to drive faster. Exactly. They compensated for the presence of safety conditions, changed their normative behavior, and all of it had very little impact. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen anything in a more contemporary context, anything at all, let's just see, anyone on the road ever in a giant, massive SUV from hell, right, the Toyota Hubris, doing something similar on the roads where you live. But you could just as easily put a man in that picture, of course, right? We're used to eating, dining, dressing, and some less savory things while we commute because we think we won't get killed. This is borne out by lots of social science research including interesting studies from the Netherlands that showed that taxi drivers, for instance, who were given disc brake systems, automatic braking systems, did not slow down. Actually, they drove closer to cars in front of them. They broke later, and they had no appreciable impact on the accident rate, and particularly bad for bicyclists and bicycle riders who wear helmets. Not because helmets don't make you safer. If you are riding a bicycle and you fall off the bike, it's a really good idea to be wearing a helmet. But the perception of safety that was created for automobile drivers of the relative safety of bicyclists was so out of whack that drivers in areas where there are bicycle safety laws drive faster and are like, yeah, I'm going to clip him because, he probably is going to survive, right? Yeah. This led to a famous law in the skydiving community called Booth's Rule Number 2, which is that the safer skydiving gear becomes, the more chances skydivers will take in order to keep the death rate constant, because that's the job of skydivers, to die at a predictable rate. And here's the punchline. We know what this looks like when it's applied to organizational culture. Because BP had a spill every 2 years, just not every 2 years in our particular backyard, for the last decade leading up to the events that happened in the Gulf. They had a culture in which it was really, really important to wear worker safety boots, but when you managed to climb up the ramp on the rigging, it was okay not to pour cement over the wellhead. A very bizarro system. So what do we do about that? Well, this is one of those places where public health instincts are going to serve us well. And I want to tell you the story of an organization we've worked very closely with called Ceasefire. Ceasefire is an extraordinary organization started by an epidemiologist named Gary Slutkin, who started working on HIV in 1981, went to Uganda, started the first really successful systemic interventions for HIV, came back to Chicago and noted that the spread of gun violence on the south side of Chicago looked a lot like the outbreaks of the illnesses he was charged with interdicting in Uganda. And so he decided to start an organization, not that would treat the spread of violence as if it were a human communicable illness, but as a human communicable illness, as a mimetic illness. And what they do, with kind of signature, the many things they do that are really innovative, one of the things they do that's incredibly important is they train formerly incarcerated drug and gang-related guys who are who have enormous street-level credibility. They give them 10 by 10 block grids, and they identify those people who are likely to be super spreaders of this particular behavior, and they act as violence interrupters. They will often stop a shooting when the guns are drawn and pointed. So I'd like you to think about being between two people who have guns pointed at each other and being able to talk those two people off a cliff. That's what these guys do. And according to the Department of Justice, by just focusing on these three things, interrupting the behaviors that cascade through the system, in this case violence, changing the mindsets of those most likely to transmit, and working on shifting the community norms around the acceptability of violence. And by the way, this is exactly how you'd go after HIV. What you'd say is, who are those most likely to be super spreaders of this illness in our community? They might be sex workers. If we can convince them to condomize and change their behavior, we won't have to interrupt, and then we have to change the norms to say it's simply unacceptable not to wear a condom. It's exactly how we went after traditional public health. This is a non-traditional application. According to the Department of Justice, this approach lowers the violent crime rate by up to 75% in its first year alone, and that's according to a randomized control trial. That's not just made-up statistics. That's real. So we're going to see more and more of this kind of behavioral contagion approach to changing norms, where we're going to see real emergent fragilities in communities all over the world. Okay, now I have a minute and 25 seconds left. So I'm going to come to the end of this one, and we're going to decide if we want to do one more. One of the most amazing things I can tell you is we're starting to see this approach being used in incredible places like the US military, where we spent a lot of time with this amazing group called Red Team University out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where they're training a corps of professional skeptics in the chain of command to break up groupthink that happens when you get young, highly lethal, highly weaponized young men and women into the field of battle without all the sufficient cultural training, how to give and improve their cognitive diversity. So changing norms and introducing cognitive diversity, they're really twin sides of the same coin. And similarly, we see it with research scientists. Robert Dunbar, a fantastic sociologist of science, discovered that when research labs are filled with people who come from entirely the same field over and over and over again, like all E. coli researchers, for instance. Sounds like fun. Delicious. They tend to interpret ambiguous results, which is what research labs have to do all the time. They tend to interpret those results largely in light of prior E. coli findings, but when you diversify the teams, the field of analogical reasoning expands dramatically, so that when you have very different kinds of people who are interpreting ambiguity, you make much faster metaphorical leaps. And he saw labs working on exactly the same problem, for instance. One would just leap ahead and leap ahead and leap ahead. It had to do with both the cognitive and the actual diversity, including the gender diversity of those labs. Okay, I'll leave you with this one story, and then we'll figure something out, people. Okay. So, related to that first story, one of the things we found as we traveled around the world looking at resilient systems was a certain kind of leader, a new kind of leadership. And it wasn't the square-jawed CEO pointing at the horizon, and it wasn't the passionate activist working the streets from the bottom up. It was sort of the Dilbert principle. It was the people in the middle, the forgotten middle, the neglected and maligned middle, who often bound together systems that were radically dissimilar from each other in temperament, in outlook. They created, essentially, they were network weavers. And in many ways, this network weaving skill is as distinctive a leadership skill as any of the other ones that we tend to worship in our culture. And this particular story of network weaving and translational leadership, and by the way, we mean translational leadership in the same way we mean translational medicine. It comes from the same idea. It starts with these two amazing women, Zini Tibete and Krista Dong. Krista is an infectious disease doc from Harvard. She trained under Bruce Walker. And Zini is a frontline antiretroviral adherence activist and adherence trainer. They work in rural KwaZulu-Natal, where the HIV infection rate among adults is about 40%. So if you can imagine, roughly half the people in the room HIV positive. Of that population, I'm sorry, I'll just say everyone over here, of all of you HIV positive, maybe one or two might actually know your status. Right? That was the circumstance in which they were working. They're working in an apartheid-era hospital in which this is the intake ward for the hospital at Edendale. That's a TB positive person up on the left-hand side, cheek by jowl with someone who's HIV positive, cheek by jowl with someone who's TB positive. People with compromised immune systems sit up against the folks who are the most infectious. And filled with the most ridiculous bureaucracy, including the fact that before you can give anybody any medication, you actually need to read them from a script you need to read to them for 3 hours, even if they are unconscious. So what I couldn't take a picture of was the person standing right off camera, like rotely reading a manuscript to people who were completely unconscious before they were allowed to give them a pill. This situation is made worse by the fact that across the street from the hospital, you have messages that directly contradict each other. The big billboard on the top says basically, don't have sex. The one on the bottom says, if you do have unprotected sex, just take a shower and everything will be okay. And that was the government talking for a long time. And this kind of mixed message combined with stigma, combined with poor information sources, created an environment in which men in particular were 4 times less likely to get tested than women, in part because it wasn't normative for them to go to the doctor unless something was wrong, right? So you have women who are going to the hospital because they're doing prematernal and they're doing all kinds of other stuff, right? Just sort of in the normal flow. It's more socially acceptable for women to go to the doctor. And so in this mix, you have the hospital serves 1 million people, of which 400,000 are HIV positive. And for that population, they only actually serve about 8,000 patients. And for that 8,000 patients, there are 3 infectious disease docs, and half of the balance of the healthcare workers are HIV positive themselves. So what do you do? Now, there's a huge and amazing project called Masiluleke, which I could tell you about another time, but I want to focus something that's completely non-technological that they did that transformed HIV care in their community, and that's this. 85% of South Africans see a traditional healer when they get ill. There's an entirely extant network of traditional healthcare workers, and they're traditional. That means they focus on a sort of ancestor-based theory of healthcare. If something's wrong with you, it's because there's an imbalance in your relationship with the ancestors, and they'll often prescribe a ritual. Including some of those rituals involve vomiting. So they involve ritualistic vomiting. One of the things that's really challenging about that is if someone is on an adherence regimen, and you're giving them medicine twice a day, and they have to perform a ritual in which they expectorate their medication, you have a real problem. So Krista and Zinni, because they are authentically in the community, because they represent and are of and are making with and not for, were able to do something truly extraordinary. And that was they began to build bridges between 2 of the most antagonistic systems in the world. The formal Western healthcare system, massively overburdened, and the stigmatized traditional healthcare network. And what they have today is a network of traditional healers who are field pathologists. They have a network of traditional healers who are their community sensors, who are doing inpatient referral. They say, hey, you know what? I do ancestors, I don't do germs, and you're sick, you need to go. Right now, take this piece of paper and go with my blessing, which suddenly evaporates the issues of stigma, because it is a cultural imprimatur. You're following the ancestors' wishes to go get better. This kind of work is long and hard and slow, and is the real long, hard, slow work of normative change, but it can only happen when you have, like in that duo, people who themselves span the cultural divide that they're trying to build bridges across. But that kind of leadership fundamentally is the kind of leadership that's going to build a more resilient planet. All right, we're out of time, and there's an amazing band, and you've been incredibly patient, so I will say thank you very, very much.